Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar all about stroke reconfiguration. I'm certain everyone there at home has had this week in their diaries for a long time, nothing to do with that big event, the royal wedding coming up, no, but the start of our event series between Kaleidoscope and UCL, funded by NIHR, all about the dissemination of findings relating to stroke reconfiguration and how that can contribute to better system change. I don't think they're doing a webinar from the wedding, are they? They're doing a live telecast.
Actually not.
No, there probably won't be a handout either. Well, there we go. Anyway, thank you so much for joining. My name's Richard Taunt from Kaleidoscope.
I'm Naomi Fullop. I'm Professor of Healthcare Organisation and Management from UCL.
And hello, my name's Steve Morris. I'm Professor of Health Economics from University College London.
And joining us from Manchester.
Hi, I'm Ruth Bowden. I'm a Professor in the Business School in Manchester.
And Ruth, is it as beautifully sunny in Manchester as it is in South London?
It is, absolutely blue sky for once.
I'm very pleased to hear it. So over the next 58 minutes or so, we're going to be hearing some presentations all about the work evaluating changes relating to stroke reconfiguration, but the heart of this is about a discussion all about the experience we have in different roles, in different contexts, about system change in the NHS. And so really this is a chance for you to ask questions about work, but also to share your experiences. Three ways you can join in this afternoon. You can use the Ask Question feature on GoToWebinar. It's that little one with the question mark. If that fails, do feel free to email us hello@kaleidoscope.healthcare. Of course, please use Twitter. The Twitter handle is @KScopeHealth or the hashtag #BetterSystemChange. Nice and snappy for you there. And if you have some sort of tech meltdown in the middle, don't fret. We are recording today and we'll be making it available afterwards for you to watch again and share with all of your family and friends. So I think we've got a great discussion ahead of us. So, I mean, what is all this? This is the first of a series about what?
So we're really pleased to be launching this event series today jointly with Kaleidoscope, which is about sharing our findings from this study of stroke reconfiguration in London and Greater Manchester for those interested in reconfiguring stroke services, but also we think and hope it has wider lessons for those involved in large-scale change across the country. So we're drawing on this research, and you'll hear more about that in this webinar. And if you're watching live, there's a second webinar this afternoon at 4 p.m. UK time, which will broaden out the discussion in terms of some international perspectives on major system change. And if you're not watching this live, that is also available on our Learning from Stroke website.
If you're not watching this live, what a great second discussion that was, Naomi. I really enjoyed it. So, yeah, we're really pleased. This event series has been supported by funding from the NIHR Enhanced Dissemination Fund, so thank you very much to them. And the two webinars are building up to a face-to-face event next week, which I'll hand over to Rich to say a few words about. Which is the content of this event series, where we're going to be in Union Chapel next Tuesday, joined by a whole host of people reflecting on the stroke experience, but I think really excitingly, a whole variety of wider experience. We'd planned for it to be a sort of an event for 50. We're now up to about 75, and we've had to sort of call a stop there. So there is a waiting list. You're very welcome to join, but it's nice to be popular, but we will be sharing all of the outputs from that day, again, on that website, Learning from Stroke, for those of you who want to join us next week. So just one quick word, if you haven't heard of us as Kaleidoscope, we're a social enterprise which focuses on bringing people together to improve health and care. So once again, my name's Richard Taunt, and I'm feeling, everyone's had that moment when you walk into a room and you realise you are by far the least educated person there. Well, surrounded by a trio of professors, my poor little BA is looking very humble, but there we go. So I think to kick us off, Naomi and Steve, you've got to talk to us about London. We're actually going to talk about
Greater Manchester,
Greater Manchester and London. So what Steve and I are doing a double act for the first part of this, and what we're going to do is we're going to present some findings you might already be familiar with, although you might not, and they are all published in the public domain, and that's from the original changes that were implemented in 2010 across both areas, and those publications and summaries of them are available on the website Learning from Stroke. Just Google that, it comes up. However, we are also very excitingly presenting some new findings on what happens subsequently, the further changes in Greater Manchester, and also whether what happened in London is the second part of the story, and those are unpublished findings, so you are the first to hear those publicly. So this study was funded by the National Institute for Health Research, the Health Services and Delivery Research Programme, and unusually it was funded for 6 years, which is why we've been able to follow these changes over that period of time, for which we are very grateful. And this is a collaboration between experts in stroke and health services researchers. From University College London, King's College London, and the University of Manchester. So why did the changes happen? What were some of the drivers? Well, this goes back to 2007, when a national stroke strategy was published in England, which set out that outcomes for stroke in the UK compared poorly with those internationally. And at that point, as is the case now, we have very good evidence about the clinical interventions that people who've had a stroke need to receive. So things like stroke needs to be treated as an emergency. It's very important to have a timely brain scan and a range of other clinical interventions. And we've known about those for some time. And back in 2007, 2008, services weren't organised to enable those clinical interventions to be delivered to all patients that had had a stroke. And Greater Manchester and London led the way in reconfiguring their services to address these concerns. So if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see what we call the before period. This is what the system looked like, the pathway looked like for stroke patients prior to the changes in London and Manchester. And someone with a suspected stroke would be taken to their local hospital, where they were either in a stroke unit or even on a general ward. And there were 12 such in Greater Manchester and 30 in London. And there was huge variation in whether or not they received all these clinical interventions. So what happened in London was, in 2010, they centralised the acute phase of that pathway into 8 hyperacute stroke units, which we call HASUs. And they are located around the capital so that no one who has a stroke is more than 30 minutes ambulance drive from one of these 8 hyperacute stroke units, and they are open 24/7. And those provide all the care that a patient needs in the first 72 hours. What happens after the first 72 hours is patient might be discharged back home if they're well enough, they might be discharged back to a care home, or they may spend some time in one of the 24 stroke units. In Greater Manchester, the model that was implemented looked somewhat different. Originally, they had been planning to implement a similar model, and we'll get to why that didn't happen then, later in the presentation. The key difference, 2 key differences about the model in Greater Manchester. First of all, this 4 hours that you can see in the figure. So patients who presented with stroke symptoms within 4 hours were taken to one of 3 hyperacute stroke units. If they presented after 4 hours, they were taken to one of 11 local hospitals where the setup was they may or may not receive all the clinical-based interventions. And of the 3 HASUs, only one operated 24/7. So as researchers, we were really excited about this because this presents what we call a natural experiment. 2 different models being implemented. We didn't know, and the implementers didn't know, whether either or both of them, what the outcome would be, whether they would provide improved care. And I should say another key difference was that in London, because of the sort of radical nature of the centralisation, 5 hospitals lost their stroke services, so ceased providing stroke care. And for those of you watching, listening, who have tried to implement changes like that where services have to be closed, you'll know how tricksy that is. In Manchester, no stroke services were closed. So in terms of what we did, what the research team did, in summary, we asked 2 kind of questions. The first in the purple box on the right-hand side, what works at what costs? So did these changes work and at what costs? And Steve will talk through how that was done and the findings from that. And then in on the left-hand side in orange, we looked at the development, implementation and sustainability of the changes. And in the middle, you'll see our framework for evaluating these, which looks at these kinds of changes, which looks at things like the decision to change, decision on which model to implement, going through to what we call implementation outcomes and then intervention outcomes. And you'll see as the presentation unfolds what the findings were. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Steve, who's going to talk through the what works at what costs findings, the quantitative findings from the original changes in 2010.
Mary, thank you very much. Steve, just before we start, just to say there's a huge amount of fantastic detail in these slides, which you can follow along as we go through, but you'll also find, again, if you're watching live, there's a handouts tab on GoToWebinar where you can download them all and look at them in microscopic detail, and we'll also make them available on the Learning from Stroke website. Sorry, Steve.
Thank you very much. So for the quantitative analysis, we did 3 types of analysis. So first, we were interested in the impact of the reconfigurations on patient outcomes, so particularly mortality and length of stay. Second, we were interested in the impact on the provision of evidence-based care. And then third, we were interested in looking at the cost effectiveness of the changes. And we did these analyses, particularly in terms of outcomes and cost effectiveness, using a type of estimation known as difference in differences. So as illustrated on the screen, essentially what we were trying to capture was the change in the outcome over time in our intervention areas, so London and Greater Manchester, but subtracting the effects that were seen over time in the control areas. So in our case, it was urban areas in the rest of England. So in terms of the analysis of patient outcomes, so for this we used data from hospital episode statistics linked with mortality data from ONS, and in all areas what we found was that mortality fell over time. In London, the fall in mortality was larger than that seen in the rest of England, so we calculated that there were around 96 additional lives saved each year. And in Manchester, again, mortality fell, but the fall was in line with what was seen in the rest of England. In terms of the impact on length of hospital stay, again, that fell in all areas, but in both London and Greater Manchester, that reduction was greater than was seen in the rest of England. In terms of the provision of evidence-based care, so we investigated this using Stroke National Audit data, and what we found was over time that the provision of recommended evidence-based care improved over time. In London, that care was more likely to be provided than elsewhere, and in Manchester, there were no significant differences than the level of care seen in the rest of England. And one particular important finding that this analysis showed was the importance of being treated in a hyperacute stroke unit, because people who were treated in HASUs were more likely to receive evidence-based care. And one of the main outputs from this analysis was that patients in London were far more likely to be treated in a HASU, so over 90% of patients, compared, for example, in Manchester, where the figure was around 40%, and we'll come back to that later. So then finally, for this bit of analysis, we also did an economic evaluation to look at the cost effectiveness of the changes using a variety of different sources. And actually, our analysis showed there was a high probability that the reconfigurations in both areas were cost effective, though for slightly different reasons. So in London, the reconfiguration was cost effective mainly due to the improvements in mortality and morbidity seen over time, balanced against the additional costs. And in Manchester, that first reconfiguration had a high probability of being cost effective, mainly due to the reduction in the cost of stroke care. So I'm now going to hand back to Naomi, who's going to try and put those findings into some kind of context.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm going to talk through our findings on how the changes were led and implemented, and go some way to explaining the outcomes that Steve presented. So first of all, in terms of leading the change, the big messages at the top of the slide are really from the London experience. So the first one is the importance of combining top-down or system-wide leadership with bottom-up clinical leadership. And at the time in London, that was the top-down was from the Strategic Health Authority, which of course now don't exist, but perhaps SDPs can fulfil this role, and we'll perhaps come to that in the discussion. But the bottom-up clinical leadership was really was very important, and if we get a chance in the discussion, I can talk a little bit more about that as well. Engaging all the relevant stakeholders from planning onwards, really important. The ambulance service was very important, as was consulting patients and the public. And what's very important about the system-wide authority leadership, it can challenge the resistance that one gets when one's trying to make changes of this kind, and particularly when it involves closing services. So in London, we characterise what happened as holding the line. The system-wide leadership kind of held the line that these changes were going to be were going to be implemented. In Greater Manchester, however, I mentioned that they had originally going to be implementing a similar model to London, but they backed off that because they wanted to keep the consensus of all involved. So the quote here is about keeping the 4-hour pathway that I mentioned, rather than going for what was called the 24-hour pathway. So I mentioned we looked at lay involvement, and just briefly, what we found, there was a huge amount of consultation went on with patients and the public, but what we found was that what we need to look at is that there's value in doing that in terms of supporting the implementation and allowing citizen participation in change. It's much harder to identify the actual impact of that kind of involvement. Now, in terms of the process of implementing those changes, as you can imagine, it's a very complex business in both areas, and they approached it quite differently in London and Greater Manchester, which again is very interesting. So in London, there was a big bang launch, which was really pressed for by the London Ambulance Service, because otherwise it would have been very confusing for them about where and when to take patients. There was accreditation, which had financial levers, so there were quality standards that units providing stroke care had to meet. And the then stroke networks provided really important hands-on facilitation to ensure the units met those quality standards. In Greater Manchester, by contrast, the changes were piloted and then phased in, which made it more difficult, particularly for the ambulance service, but for others, about where to take patients on what day. There was not the same accreditation or financial levers, and the network was there providing a platform to share learning rather than facilitating meeting the quality standards. In terms of patient experience, what we found with our interviews with patients and carers is that centralised service can offer a good experience despite the increased travel, which is often something that patients and their families naturally worry about. However, it's really important for services to provide clear information to patients and their carers at an early stage. So in terms of an overview of our findings, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but essentially what we think we can show is a link between
the way the changes were implemented, the type of model. So on the left-hand side, this is shown for London, the fact that it was a simple, inclusive model, that it was a big bang launch, and as Steve said, the importance of the hyperacute stroke units in providing the care that stroke patients need, and the proportion of patients, high proportion in London that receive that care, which we then has a strong argument for supporting why the decreases in mortality and length of stay happened. And on the right hand side in green is kind of the sort of obverse for Greater Manchester, which meant they didn't achieve quite the same improvements as in London. So what influence have our findings had? And again, we can come back to this in some more detail, perhaps in the discussion. But in terms of our influence in Greater Manchester, actually originally a year after the changes were implemented in 2011, further centralisation was recommended. However, there were significant delays in that implementation, and Ruth will come on to talk about why that was. But our findings that were published in the BMJ on the reductions in mortality and length of stay in London helped move things along. And actually, we were asked if we could provide a calculation of the number of lives, the additional number of lives that would be saved in Greater Manchester if the same effect was achieved in London. Steve crunched those numbers and came up with the figure of that this could prevent an additional 50 prevent an additional 50 deaths from happening in Greater Manchester. And you see from the slide that was used in their communications. So these services in Greater Manchester were further centralised in March 2015, and we were fortunate enough to be able to study these further changes alongside sustainability in London. So now I'm going to hand back to Steve, who's going to go through what's happened in Greater Manchester and what's happened subsequently in London in terms of the clinical outcomes and so on.
Thank you very much. So for this analysis, we really focused on two things, two separate analyses. So first, we were interested in investigating the impact of the changes in Greater Manchester using similar processes to the one I described before. Excuse me. And secondly, we were interested in evaluating whether the effects that we saw in London were maintained over time because there was no further reconfiguration to investigate. So in terms of the impact on patient outcomes in Greater Manchester, so we used similar data before, though more up to date. And so what we found across all hospitals in Greater Manchester, there was a reduction in mortality that mirrored the reduction seen in the rest of England, which was a borderline statistically significant difference. But when we looked at outcomes among patients treated in the hyperacute stroke units, we found there was a significant reduction in mortality over and above that seen in the rest of England. And given the increase in volume of patients going through the HASUs, which we'll look at in a minute, we calculated that translated into about an extra 70 additional lives saved per year because of this reconfiguration. And then in terms of the impact on length of hospital stay, again, we found that in Manchester there was an additional reduction over and above that seen in the rest of England, which translated into several thousand fewer bed days each year. In terms of the impact on the provision of evidence-based care, so I talked before about the importance of being treated in a hyperacute stroke unit. So when we looked at the data for this analysis, there was a large increase in the proportion of people treated in a hyperacute stroke unit in Greater Manchester. So going from around 40% when we did the first evaluation up to just shy of 90% in 2015-16. And that led to improvements on average in the provision of evidence-based care, particularly with regard to the front door services, so the care that people received on arriving at the hospital, which there was an improvement over and above that seen in the rest of England, and in terms of specialist assessments while in care as well. So moving on to London, so the focus here was slightly different because what we were interested in investigating was whether the original impacts from the reconfiguration in 2010 were maintained over time. And as shown in these two graphs, where the vertical line represents the timing of the reconfiguration, there was no significant variation in mortality or length of stay following the original reconfiguration. So that suggests, or indicates that that original impact has been sustained over time. And we've also done some further work looking at the impact on the various processes of care, and that was replicated in those analyses too. So I'm now going to hand back to Naomi, who's going to discuss this in a bit more context.
Thanks, Steve. So how was it that Greater Manchester managed to achieve those improvements through further centralising, and how were the improvements sustained in Greater Manchester? And we drew on our qualitative study to answer those questions. So I talked about the delay in Greater Manchester from further centralising between 2011 and March 2015, and there were various local issues that led to those delays, but also national issues that were faced around the country. So the turbulence caused by the 2013 NHS reforms and so on. But despite all these obstacles, the changes were implemented, and Ruth's going to talk in quite a bit more detail about how that was achieved. In London, faced similar obstacles in terms of sustaining the improvements, particularly from the turbulence again from the 2013 NHS reforms and the pressure to achieve national targets, for example, the 4-hour A&E target, the national staffing shortages and pressures on social care. And this led to pressures in delays in transferring patients between the HASU and stroke unit, and difficulties in finding HASU and stroke unit beds. However, as you've heard from Steve, despite this, the delivery of interventions for the clinical-based, evidence-based clinical interventions and outcomes was sustained over the period that we studied. And so how was that? And we've sort of found 4 big reasons. First of all, the model itself, that the service standards were linked to the tariff, was very important in maintaining the model. And the service reviews that happened regularly that ensured that those quality standards were continued to be met. The type of leadership, there was continuity, and there has been continuity in the leadership of the stroke system across London, and its adaptability to different and changing environment. And finally, independent evidence through the National Stroke Audit, SNAP, and through our own research has helped support the sustainability in London. So really, finally then from us, this slide draws together what we hope are the lessons for major system change in stroke, but also potentially other types of large-scale change in other kinds of clinical areas. So what we found was that centralised acute stroke services in urban areas can reduce mortality and length of stay, and they are cost effective. There's an advantage of models where all stroke patients are eligible for a hyperacute stroke unit, and we've shown that the impact on care and outcomes can be sustained over time. In terms of the planning, implementation and sustainability, and this is where we hope there are wider lessons, and very interested to hear from those of you listening, watching, this combination of top-down and bottom-up leadership that I talked about. Consistent adaptive leadership can facilitate implementation and sustainability. The importance of engaging all relevant stakeholders, including patients and the public, from planning onwards. Implementation, in terms of implementation, the importance of having quality standards linked to financial incentives and hands-on facilitation. And then finally, independent evidence. And I guess the final message is that this kind of change isn't a one-off. Need to consistently attend to the evidence and consider further change. So thank you very much for listening. Further information from all that we've been talking about is available from that website, Learning from Stroke.
Maybe, Steve, thank you very much. A huge host of intellectual capital there, which we'll come to discuss in a second. But just a reminder about how to join in. So you can use that Ask Question feature on GoToWebinar. You can email us, hello@Kaleidoscope. You can tweet using the hashtag #BetterSystemChange. Those tend to work better if you are watching live. If you're watching afterwards, please still do tweet or share views by email. That Ask Question feature probably isn't there any longer. Steve, Naomi, thank you very much. I think in a world full of acronyms, we should probably give credit to HAZU for being one of the best acronyms out there. I'm sure that sort of its linguistic tone was thought about in great detail when it was being produced. Right, Ruth, we're going to come to hear more about the Greater Manchester story. Ruth, welcome back. Ruth, if you want to say next slide, and I'll move on as we go through.
Thank you very much. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what happened in Greater Manchester, both during the research and since the research has finished, because we're still in contact with the stroke system here and doing a lot of things and presenting about these findings. Next. This is a slide that was been developed in Greater Manchester to show the whole stroke pathway. And the reason I'm showing it here is because our research was predominantly on the first 3 phases of that, as far as discharge. But obviously for improving stroke care, we also need to look at rehabilitation. And I'll come back to that right at the end when I update you on what's happening in Greater Manchester now. Next. In terms of timing, just in case you're a picture person rather than a figures person, this is a full chart of what's happened when in Manchester. And you will see that a year after we did the partial centralisation Greater Manchester A, we had that internal review that said further changes needed. Everyone agreed that, but the formal decision on that wasn't made until 2013. And as you can see, it was 2015 before the changes were made to what Naomi's referred to as Greater Manchester B. So there's a long period of time there that I'm going to talk about. And I'm also going to talk towards the end about the ODN, the Operational Delivery Network, who they are and what they're doing now. Next. And really for information, just to show when this research was actually carried out and when we collected data. So our quantitative data, as Steve said, we finished collecting that in March 2016. I'm going to talk about what's happened since then as well. Next slide. Naomi has already talked about both the timing and the internal things, and also the system obstacles, particularly the 2013 reforms, and I'll touch on those as we go through. However, next slide. What I want to focus on is what actually may facilitated and helped us in Greater Manchester to make this further change. One of the things that helped was the formal structure. Those of you who know about the NHS will know that in 2014, April 2014, the Health and Social Care Act, kind of shadow form before then, and there'd been a lot of churn, a lot of changes in people as PCTs had been abolished. We had an interim period, we had CCGs being set up. It wasn't quite clear who was doing what. But from 2014, what was called an implementation board was set up. It was chaired by a commissioner. It included a number of commissioners. It included the 3 HAZUs as providers and one of the district stroke centres, stroke units. And it had a single project manager who really coordinated the work of that implementation board. And it wasn't until that was established in 2014 that really the changes started to be planned in earnest and timings actually worked out, despite a decision to change in September 2013. So there's no doubt that there was delay because of the national changes that were happening, although they were affecting everybody. Naomi's mentioned already that our research evidence was very helpful. That was particularly so in the final point there, where the leaders, what we called, held the line this time in Manchester on the timing of the change. So it wasn't until November 2014, now I've just got this right, November 2014, that they agreed in Manchester that actually the changes would be implemented and would actually happen from March 2015. And that pushing for a date, you'll see the quote at the bottom there, the data that we had produced became very important. People started saying that the longer we wait to actually put this in place, the more people are going to die. And having that discussion was very important. They also went, in terms of following up what had happened before, for a big bang launch. The ambulance service particularly were very clear that they weren't having any of this pilot phasing because it just caused confusion for everybody. Nobody knew where any patients were supposed to be going. So those were a lot of the key things that pushed that further change, although it is fair to say that there was a year when very little moved forward. Next. So I'm going to summarise briefly now what's happened since then. So since the reconfiguration, this is the system that we've now got with 3 hyper-acute specialist units, one open 24/7, the other open certain hours, 7 days a week, but not during the night. Then we've got 6 separate district stroke centre stroke units and, as I'll come on to, 16 community rehab teams. And we now have a thing called the ODN, the Operational Delivery Network, which is working across the system to facilitate the operation of the system. And the slides that I'm going to show you next from now on come from the ODN because they're the ones who studied what's happening. Next. Thank you. So this is their data from SNAP about the stroke pathway, and you can see that the full centralisation happened and immediately more patients started going to the HASU and far less to the district stroke centres. And you can see that by the time we'd finished our research data collection, things were beginning to even out. Steve mentioned that at the time of our analysis, 86% of patients were going to HASUs. That is now, as of end of March this year, 2018, now over 94% of patients going to HASUs. So they've continued to reduce the number that are going to the district stroke centres, and the vast majority, in line just about with what London do, are going to the HASUs now. Next. This is perhaps the most powerful slide in terms of what's happened in the Greater Manchester system. This is the SNAP data from the Central Stroke Audit. And as you can see from the arrows at the top of that slide, full centralisation immediately from that time on, there's far more green, which means A rated, which is the top rating. And since our data collection was completed in 2016, again, we're now very proud, or have been in Greater Manchester, very proud that all the units have been A rated. The yellow bit of that diagram, PAT is one of the trusts in Manchester, Pennine Acute Trust, that has 4, or did have 4 separate hospitals or with stroke units, one of which was a HASU. They did their own sort of sub-centralisation in the latter part of 2014, and you can see from there that there was already improvement. So we've got more data here that shows that from a SNAP point of view, or the data measured in SNAP, centralisation does improve the performance of stroke units, and you can see that very clearly on this diagram. Next slide. There's an interesting debate, I think, to be had now about what happens when you don't have a wonderful research team like we have to do all your detailed mortality analysis. And the answer is that you have to use routine data, and the ODN now use routine data. You'll see the bottom left-hand diagram there is crude mortality compared to the rest of England. And as far as Greater Manchester is concerned, they are very confident that their mortality is continuing to improve or reduce, depending on how you want to describe it. But I think there is a real challenge ongoing for people when you don't have the benefit of the kind of research analysis to actually say, what sort of measure should we use? We can perhaps pick that up. Next. This is the latest slide from the ODN that was presented just a couple of weeks ago at a conference in Manchester, and it shows, as you can see, that not everything in the garden is rosy. So we're beginning to learn that sustainability, as in London, is difficult. I think these issues are fairly common and have been experienced in London. There's repatriation delays. We're now, say, not got all A-rated stroke units. Some of the DSCs have struggled in their performance recently, and the main HASU, the 24/7 HASU, is now the biggest one in the country, bigger than any of the individual ones in London, and is really struggling, partly because of the numbers of stroke mimics, and partly because it's also starting to provide a thrombectomy service in Greater Manchester in the northwest, but also because there's lack of standardisation of community and rehab services. And that's actually blocking patients moving through the system now in the way that they should. Next slide. This is the ODN's summary of what they believe their critical success factors have been. They rightly say how wonderful they are and all the great things they've been able to achieve, and I'm not saying that that's not important. They actually claim the decision to centralise as part of their critical success factor, although that happened before the ODN happened, but they have definitely been able to build a collaborative approach and trust over time, and include the patient voice, as I'll come on to in my final slides. Next slide. This is a framework that we used in one of our academic publications from this project, where we looked at what are called the 5 simple rules for major system change. They're the 5 down the left-hand side there, developed in the paper by Alan Best et al., which was a realist review published in 2012. Alan Best is on the second webinar, which you can see there, the crash course in system change internationally at 4 o'clock today, so you can find out more about that. What we did was to take those 5 simple rules, use them to analyse the data that we had from Greater Manchester A and from London, and adapt or extend those rules very slightly. So the bits in the grey box down the right are the things that we extended and showed that was important. And I've used this framework now to analyse what's happened in Greater Manchester B and also what has happened since Greater Manchester B, supported by the ODN. Next slide. So this is the summary really of what we found for Greater Manchester B and for since we stopped doing this research. The issue of designated and distributed leadership that we've talked about, very clearly facilitated by the implementation board, making the decision and driving that through. It wasn't a single person, but that board had all the key people on it. And as we've mentioned, the decision to centralise was based on robust evidence, on the feedback that our research had given to that, and they very clearly attended to history and went for big bang. There was a real reflection in Manchester that we're not going to repeat what we did the first time. In terms of engaging physicians or clinicians or professionals, actually this was less of an issue because it was the same people being engaged in Greater Manchester B as were engaged in Greater Manchester A. And there was a lot of positive stuff coming from the personal relationships that had been built up during Greater Manchester A. So it was very much not managers against doctors, as it had been previously, or even unit against unit. After the recognition that what they'd done in Greater Manchester A wasn't really improving the system in the way they wanted it to, there was a common view that we need to make this better. And involving patients and families for Greater Manchester B, there were 2 patient representatives on the implementation board, but there wasn't a wider formal consultation because it was decided that this is actually not a wider thing. This is not a new change, it's just an extension, a change of the change we've already made. The ODN, as you can see, also identified similar things that were going on. They've got a very collaborative approach. They're building on those relationships and trust over time. They use data routinely to demonstrate impact, as you see from the slides I've included, and they provide support, including some facilitation if necessary, for change management. They're now focusing very much on the rehabilitation side of things. That's their big priority now, to get common rehabilitation support and processes across the whole of Greater Manchester. And they're very strongly including the patient voice now. The ODN board is co-chaired by a patient, and they have a patient forum, which has been particularly important in looking at their reconfiguration of community services. So I think we can see that those 5 simple rules both apply to Greater Manchester B, but also can be applied to what's happening in sustaining that work. Next slide. Thank you. Any questions on Manchester, I'll be happy to take them during the discussion.
Ruth, thank you very much indeed. Again, a huge amount of content presented in a very short space of time. We are very grateful. That's 6 years worth of research presented in about 40 minutes, a bit under. So well done to all 3 presenters. Thank you very much. A reminder how you can join in. We've got a bit over 15 minutes for questions, discussion. 3 ways to do that. Use the Ask Question feature on GoToWebinar. Email us, hello@kaleidoscope.healthcare. Tweet using the hashtag #BetterSystemChange. And again, we are recording. Welcome if you're watching back afterwards. So you'll be able to watch this later. Questions already starting to come through. Thank you very much indeed. Please do keep them coming. And I suppose, Naomi, I'm going to come to you first. The obvious question is, great, well, look, this seems like it works. You know, can we just roll it out everywhere, please? A couple of questions coming through here. Firstly, from Stephanie Hood. Stephanie, thank you very much indeed. Just asking, can you talk about the evidence for the impact of this model in sort of rural areas? You know, does it just work in urban? And then Steve, I'm going to come to you and just say, is there a minimum scale and population density required to make a hazard cost effective? Tim Keane, thank you very much for that that question. And then Ruth, I wonder if we could come to you and just if you could talk about sort of the system maturity in Manchester, and whether actually that was an important bit of context which changed over time, which meant that it sort of B worked better than A. So Naomi on urban rural, Steve on sort of cost effectiveness and hazards, and then Ruth on system maturity. Naomi, simple question: does it work in rural areas?
So there is some debate about this and discussion nationally and in a number of rural areas. In terms of our research, we are careful academics and we are careful to conclude that we think our lessons apply particularly to urban areas in terms of centralising, and that and Steve's nodding, so that's good. We personally wouldn't say yes, absolutely in rural areas you should implement the same system. Their understanding needs to be some adaptations because of travel time and so on and so on. A number of less urban, more rural areas are considering changes at the moment. My question is, why haven't more urban areas centralised? That's my big question. So if anyone's listening from or watching from Birmingham, why hasn't it happened there? In Glasgow, they're considering it, but if I lived in any of those urban areas, that's the question I'd be asking.
If there's anyone on the line wanting to represent a whole city, please do give us your response. Steve, cost effectiveness and minimum population size for hazard.
Thank you. So it's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't think we know the answer, because in terms of the data we had for this particular analysis, all we had was data on London and Manchester. And I think to be able to answer that question properly, we'd need to be able to evaluate reconfigurations in other areas with various different sizes. Obviously, cost effectiveness will depend on the kind of the throughput of patients, but I'm afraid we're not allowed to give you, we can't give you a magic number for that, I'm afraid.
You don't want to make one up? 7?
No, so a cautious academic, I'm afraid I'm a bit reluctant to do that.
No, but really, it's a really important point. Ruth, I'm really interested by this sort of, by what you were saying about the personal relationships and how the context of the system might have differed between the two implementation phases in Manchester. Ruth, we just need to unmute you.
Thank you. I knew I'd forget something. Thank you. We've got a lot of data on this, both from our own research and from what we've observed since then. So certainly going to Manchester B from A was not as difficult because you didn't have to form new relationships. And as I said, it was very quickly accepted that, A really wasn't working. And I think whilst that helped, that didn't overcome the challenges of the Health and Social Care Act and all the disruption that caused in terms of organisation. I think it did mean that people were much more focused on, there was no debate about what is the goal here. The goal is to get a model like London, and let's do that as soon as we can. And a lot of frustration from a lot of people that didn't happen more quickly, although no one to blame about that. I think one of the internal delays that we referred to was actually about other contexts. So even reconfigurations like this are in the wider context of provision of acute care in any big area, urban area. So one of the HAZUs was having a lot of problems with their A&E performance. And there were questions over, should they continue to be a HAZU because they can't manage their own A&E? Actually, that what they did in the end was have a separate area within A&E for the stroke patients. So if you're taken to that HAZU by ambulance as a stroke patient, you go straight into the stroke bit, so you don't get caught up in whatever the other issues may be in A&E. So I think it is quite important to look at the wider context for what's happening when you do this reconfiguration. And that's still an issue in Manchester because there are further acute mergers, chains, etc. on the cards. You'll have noticed in one of my slides that one of the DSCs completely closed down about 18 months ago. So we have now lost a stroke service in one area because it simply wasn't viable. There weren't enough patients going through to sustain the number of staff that were needed. So I think it is very much a mature system. And I think don't be afraid to change again if things aren't working would be the key lesson that would come out from Manchester.
Ruth, lovely. In a world full of hyperclinical language, I love the fact that you just have a stroke bit just go in there. That's, I think, how we should turn things. More questions coming through. Thank you very much indeed. Again, please do send them through if you've still got the one. Matt Tagley, thank you very much for joining. Matt, really interesting question, saying, with hindsight, were the differences between the two models conscious decisions or issues of implementation?
So yeah, really nice question. So they were conscious decisions, and I referred to the how the different areas dealt with resistance, and that Manchester were originally going to implement the more sort of radical version, and they didn't consciously in order to maintain the consensus of all the providers. In London, it was also a very conscious decision, and one of the really important features was that two senior stroke clinicians gave up their services for the greater good of services in London. So I mentioned that each of the 8 hyperacute stroke units are located in London where no one's more than 30 minutes ambulance drive away, and that meant moving services out of the centre to areas of greater population in the outer ring, and that meant that was led by these 2 senior clinicians who gave up their services, which possibly is quite unusual, but it was very important actually and also symbolically in terms of stating what the community, the stroke community, were trying to do for stroke patients in London.
Well, and it's a really interesting point which we've got into, and it's lovely again to have the natural experiment. So just to come back to, if Manchester were to have its time again, would it choose to go down a different route? And if it did, would it have worked?
There's lots of hypothetical questions.
One word answer, you know,
I think the answer, what Naomi said, is entirely correct, that the original plan was to fully centralise, but at a fairly late stage in the process, one particular trust decided that they weren't going to go along with everybody else and go along with this. And so the decision was taken to compromise on the model to keep that trust in. The alternative would have been to say, well, stuff it, you know, you just do what your own thing and we'll do it in the rest of Greater Manchester. And that wouldn't have worked. That wouldn't have been a whole system change. So if they were to have their time again, I know that the people who were involved would have wanted to do it differently, but whether they could have done it differently at the time is quite different. What I would say is that, as lots of people know, you know, we're in the era of devolution in Greater Manchester that some people think is kind of magic. Well, it's not very different on the ground, but actually one of the things we're noticing actually in another research project that we're doing, looking at a different service reconfiguration at the moment, is that there is much more now a tendency towards cooperation being the norm. Okay, so trying very much to change the culture so that actually we are here for the Greater Manchester good rather than the good of your individual trust. That's a tough thing to do, but that's a very clear direction from the current leadership of the system in Manchester. So if they were doing it now, I think it would have gone forward as a full centralisation, because there would have been the ability and the culture to cooperate in the way that wasn't quite there in 2009, 2010.
Ruth, thank you very much indeed. Steve, a nice technical question for you. Tim, thank you again, Tim. Saying lots of focus on benefits of reduced mortality. What about reduced disabilities? Are the savings inclusive of benefits from reduced disability and associated caring costs?
Thanks. Yes, so there's a few things here. So our main focus in the study was on mortality. That was our kind of primary outcome, and also an outcome that we had very good data on. We did also look at the impact on disability, so mainly in terms of modified ranking scale and also some stuff using the Bartle index. But it's fair to say, and we did show some effects there, it's fair to say that the data were not as good, particularly in terms of over the longer term, given, for example, what's available in the audit data over the time period that we were interested in. So there were some impacts, but there was a lot of uncertainty, so with very wide confidence intervals. And then that did also feed through into the economic evaluation as well. So we were interested in balancing the costs of the reconfiguration and the sort of the higher cost in the hyperacute phase against any potential cost savings in terms of length of stay, and then also following discharge in terms of impacts on reduced disability. But again, there was a lot of uncertainty in that, and we had to account for that in the sensitivity analysis that we undertook. So those impacts were included, but as I say, with some uncertainty. And for anyone who's interested in finding out a little bit more in that, so we had a paper published recently in a journal called Health Research Policy and Systems, the first author being our colleague Rachel Hunter, where it describes in a lot more detail the economic evaluation that we undertook.
Steve, lovely, thank you very much. We're coming to the end of our session. We've got about 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to ask fellow presenters to start thinking about one particular reflection they might want to share at the end of our session. But before we do that, just if I can take chair's prerogative, Naomi, that there's a huge amount of interesting findings here, and I find particularly interesting that some of it actually pushes back on some of the conventional wisdom of the day. So you've got positive things to say about financial incentives, about standards, about a clear system-wide authority, and you don't say just pilot it until it works. There was a clear that Big Bang is what worked. Multifaceted, of course, but an interesting counter view to how we might think about improvement in other parts of the NHS.
It is, and I think they are to be thought about within your context and within the type of change you're planning. So we're not saying this is a recipe and these are the things you must follow. I think what we're saying is these are things to think about. So in terms of your leadership model, you may not, where you are, have a strong system-wide leadership. There are other models. Ruth referred to another reconfiguration we're looking at. And in that one, what's been really important is the network of providers that has worked outside system-wide leadership to implement significant change. So what we would say is, and in terms of the Big Bang versus pilot or phased, that will be different in different contexts. It may not be appropriate in other types of services to do it Big Bang. In an emergency situation, as with stroke, it is. We've had pretty good evidence for that. So these are things to think about within your local context, is what we'd say. And the point about the quality standards and financial incentives is that I think that what was important was that there was buy-in, there was collective buy-in from everybody to those. It wasn't seen as enforced. People didn't feel done to. They felt they were part of this big, exciting change that could improve care.
Lovely. Naomi, thank you very much. I'm aware we've still got questions coming through, which is lovely. We are going to be out of time for answering them live now, but what we will do, Kim, Sally, thank you for your questions. We'll be putting responses on Twitter in just a second, if that's okay. So I'm not be able to cover them in the couple of minutes we have left. So I'm going to go around. I'm going to start with Steve, then Naomi, then Ruth. One particular reflection to leave us with at the end of our discussion. Steve.
Well, I'm interested in evaluation, and evaluating changes of this kind is exceedingly difficult. But the take-home message for me is when one is evaluating something like this, it's important to account for changes that occurred elsewhere in the rest of England over the same period of time to try and extract an accurate impact.
That difference in difference.
Indeed.
Absolutely. Thank you. Naomi.
I think my take home is think about implementation early and often. So think about, these are very complex changes that have implications for the workforce, for capital and so on. And it's about thinking and planning for those really early on. And the optimism bias that is present, which is great in the NHS, needs to be counted a little bit in terms of thinking through really what are the timescales you need for these implementation processes to be successful.
Okay, thank you. And Ruth?
I think the take-home message I would have is that the 5 simple rules which I referred to really do work and really do help. And sometimes we need 5 simple things. They're not everything, but they talk about leadership, feedback, history, engagement, etc. And that actually both in London and in Manchester, we were able to do that despite the national policy changes. And that's what it felt like. Health and Social Care Act was a big issue and a big disruption, but these changes have happened and patients' lives are being saved as a result.
Ruth, what a fantastic note to end on. Can I say, Steve, Naomi, Ruth, thank you again for such articulate presentations on such a complex topic, a masterclass on how to do such things. In terms of what happens after today, well, after now, we've got our second webinar of the day at 4 o'clock, as Ruth referred to, joined by Alan Best, the author of that Simple Changes paper. Don't think just because Ruth put up the 5 simple rules, you now know it. Come and join us and listen to Alan. Again, we'll tweet the link if you haven't registered. So that's 4 o'clock today. The all-day learning event is next Tuesday, 22nd. And all of the information and the papers relating to this are available at Learning from Stroke, as will be the video of this webinar. You might well be watching it back. So the time at 2 o'clock, we'll say thank you all very much indeed for joining. And we hope to see you either next Tuesday or on our webinar later on today. Thanks so much. Goodbye.